Hello, Father's Faithful. Thank you for joining me for Sunday School today. I've been reading in the book of Exodus, and I read a familiar story, but something kind of got my attention this week that I'd like to talk to you about. It reminded me of something. Do any of you remember that old TV show called Bewitched? Well, you know that in that show, Samantha would just wiggle her nose and presto, the dishes were washed, the house was spotless, and the problems just disappeared in an instant. No sweat, no struggle, just magic. Now, sometimes I look at my kitchen and my mess and I think if I could just wiggle my nose, wouldn't that be nice? But living a Christian life is not nose wiggling magic. God doesn't call us to use magic or need magic. He calls us to have faith and to be obedient. Well, in the book of Exodus, there is a man, and this man has a stick. It's actually a shepherd's staff. And that ordinary object in that story is what got my attention. I thought, my goodness, this man does some mighty extraordinary things with this ordinary stick. You know, God doesn't need magic because He uses what is already in our hands. In the book of Exodus, chapter 4, Moses is standing before this burning bush, and God is calling him to confront Pharaoh and deliver Israel. And Moses is afraid. He questions God. He hesitates. Exodus 4:1 says, "Suppose they do not believe me." But God doesn't give him a lightning bolt. He didn't give him a sword. He asked him a question. He says, "What is that in your hand?" Exodus 4:2. And Moses, who was the man, he replied, "It's a staff." Now, this shepherd's staff actually represented his livelihood and his identity as a shepherd. It represented his ordinary daily life. It wasn't impressive, it wasn't royal, and it wasn't powerful. And yet God said, throw it on the ground. It was what was in his hand. And God said, throw it on the ground. And Moses obeyed. And when he did, it became a serpent. And then God told him to pick it up. You remember this story. And it became a staff again. So here is the first lesson in this story. When surrendered to God, the ordinary does become extraordinary. On Bewitched, the TV show, the power came from Samantha herself. It was effortless and it was self-generated. But in Exodus, the power never was in the stick. The power never was in Moses. The power was always in God. Exodus 4:20 calls it the staff of God. Now notice, it started out as the staff of Moses, but once it was surrendered, it became the staff of God. And that's the difference between magic and miracles. Magic says, look what I can do. And miracles say, look what God has done. You know, Pharaoh's magicians could imitate some of those signs. Exodus 7:11 and 12 tells us that. Exodus 7:11 through 12, sorry about that, tells us that. But their staffs were swallowed up, and God's power was supreme. God doesn't compete with illusions. He reveals His authority to us. And throughout these plagues in the book of Exodus, In fact, they're all the way through Exodus chapter 7 through chapter 10. God repeatedly tells Moses to stretch out his staff, and the river Nile turns to blood. Remember the frogs and the gnats and the hail? Every single time Moses had to lift his staff, and his staff actually became an instrument of obedience. So imagine if Moses had said this. Imagine he just said, Lord, can't you just do it without me lifting this stick? But God invites us to participate. He invited Moses to participate. Faith is not passive. Faith moves. God could have delivered Israel without Moses. We all know that. But he chose to work through him. And that is exactly the way God still works today. And then Exodus 14 is one of the greatest moments in Scripture. Israel is trapped. Mountains are on both sides. Pharaoh is behind, and the sea's in front, and they are just about to panic. And then God says in Exodus 14:16, what? Raise that staff, raise that stick, and stretch out your hand over the sea to divide the water. Notice again, God didn't tell Moses to wiggle anything. No instant magic. Moses had to lift that staff over an impossible situation. And when he did, you know what happened. The sea parted. The staff did not part the sea, though. God did. But Moses had to lift it. He had to obey God. You know, some of us are waiting for God to move while our staff is still down by our side. And God says, lift what I have already given you. In Exodus 17, the people are thirsty and they're complaining again. They did that really often. And God tells Moses, strike the rock and water will come out of it. That's Exodus 17:6. With what? Well, with that same staff. The staff that judged Egypt will now bring life to Israel. The same instrument can be used for judgment or blessing depending on God's purpose. And this tells us something really powerful. What you place in God's hands can bring deliverance to others. Now, later in the scripture, Moses is going to make a mistake. In Numbers 20, he strikes that rock in anger instead of speaking to it as God had commanded. Now, the danger is this. When God uses you, you might start thinking that the power is yours when it never was. The staff was wood. The power was God. Bewitched, that old TV show, that teaches fantasy control. And Exodus teaches us surrendered obedience. One is self-centered power, and the other is God-centered dependence. Now, you may be thinking today, well, I don't have a staff. I don't have a shepherd's staff. But what do you have? Do you have a voice? Do you have a testimony? Do you have a kitchen table for hospitality? Do you have a musical gift? Do you have a prayer life? Do you have grandchildren that you can influence? Do you have a profession? Do you have a burden for someone? When God asked Moses, what is that in your hand? You know what he was asking? He was asking, will you trust me with what you already have? God rarely starts with what we wish we had. No, he starts with what we already have, what we have right now. And why staff? Because if God had used something spectacular, Moses just might have relied on the object. But a shepherd's stick, there's no glory in that. So when the sea parts, everybody knows it's not Moses. It's not his shepherd's staff. No, this is God. And God often chooses shepherds over princes, and he often chooses slings over swords and crosses over thrones so that no one can boast. And there's another piece of wood in Scripture. It was rough and ordinary and common, and yet when surrendered to God's plan, the cross, became the instrument of salvation. The cross of Christ looked like defeat, but in God's hands, it became victory over death. And just as that staff lifted over the sea brought deliverance, Jesus lifted on that cross brought eternal deliverance. So the power was never in the wood. It was in the obedience, and it was in the will of God. You know, we live in a culture today that wants results right now. Kind of like Bewitched, kind of like Samantha when she wiggled her nose and things happened immediately. Clean this mess instantly, and fix this marriage instantly, and grow spiritually instantly. But God's way is different. He says, pick up your staff and stretch it out and walk forward and trust me. Faith often looks like lifting a stick over a sea that hasn't parted yet. But obedience always comes before that breakthrough. If God asks you today, what is that in your hand? What would you say? Your answer might seem small. It might seem insignificant. It might seem ordinary. But surrendered to God, it becomes the staff of God. And when it becomes the staff of God, seas part, and slavery ends, and water flows, and nations change. Because the miracle is not in the object. The miracle is in the obedience. So, stop wishing for magic. I'm going to stop wishing that I could wiggle my nose and my kitchen would be completely clean. Start surrendering what you already have in your hand. And I believe that you and I both will be surprised at what God will do. Thank you for listening to the lesson today. Thank you for the prayers for our family. We have felt them all week long. Thank you for the kind words and the prayers as we've put our precious, precious mother to rest this week. And we know she's in the arms of Jesus, and we thank you for your prayers. We're praying for your families too. We know some situations that are really, really hard right now with people that we love, and I know that you have people in your family who desperately need prayers, so we're praying for them too. God knows who they are. Hope you have a wonderful week, and Lord willing, I'll see you again next week. Thank you for listening.